Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. In this column, the writer talks about the topic of poverty estimation. According to the writer, if the problems in the economy has to be fixed, then the government has to come forward to accurately count the number of poor in the country by establishing a fair and rational poverty line. See, economic experts have been sounding alarm bells in India to get the attention of the government because, according to them, India's economic downturn over the last few years, accompanied with the economic destruction caused by the pandemic and the lockdowns, has pushed millions of Indian citizens into abject poverty. See, even before the pandemic struck, the Indian economy was witnessing a structural slowdown. Since 2016, India's economic growth was seeing a downturn due to a combination of structural issues in the Indian economy, followed by the adverse impact of demonetization. Demonetization had severely hit small businesses and especially the unorganized sector, thereby driving down India's economic growth and thus pushing millions of people into poverty. By 2019, the Indian economy was reporting a sustained slowdown, and then the pandemic and the lockdowns hit the country very hard, which, according to several estimates and studies, has pushed millions of people into poverty. In this context, the writer points out the importance of measuring the number of poor people in the country accurately by establishing a rational poverty line in order to fix the economic problems. See, to understand India's recent slide with regard to poverty numbers, first we need to understand the definition of poverty. According to the World Bank, poverty is pronounced deprivation in well-being and it comprises of many dimensions. It is usually measured on the basis of income and as well as on the levels of consumption. Essentially, low income and the inability to acquire the basic goods and services that are necessary for survival with dignity indicates poverty levels. The conventional approach to measuring poverty is to specify a minimum expenditure that is required to purchase a basket of goods and services that are seen to be necessary to satisfy the basic human needs, and this minimum expenditure is called the poverty line. The World Bank has set this line at $2 per day. So, according to the World Bank, a daily income of at least $2 is the minimum level required to sustain above poverty levels, and anything below that pushes the people into abject poverty where they cannot afford even basic goods and services for their essential survival and for their dignity. The writer here points out several estimates from both domestic and global institutions, which clearly display India's slide into poverty over the last half a decade. A survey that was conducted in 2013 with regard to median income had shown that India's median income falls in the very low category, and India stood at the 99th position out of 131 countries, thereby making India a lower middle income country. In fact, this was the lowest ranking amongst the BRICS group of countries, and the low median income clearly indicates the lower purchasing power of Indian citizens. Next, latest data with regard to consumption indicates that consumption levels of essential items has gone down significantly, and a major fall in monthly per capita consumption has been recorded. This data is for the year 2017-18, and this happens to be the first time since 1972-73 that India's consumption levels have gone down on a per capita monthly basis. Then, of course, we have the Global Hunger Index, which has clearly placed India in the serious hunger category, which is again seen as a reflection of the declining consumption levels in the country. Even the official statistics of the Government of India, such as the National Family Health Survey 5, has shown increasing levels of malnutrition, infant mortality rate, and maternal mortality rate. These key health indicators are seen as an indirect reflection of poverty levels in the country. And after years of success in improving these indicators, India has started registering a decline over the last few years. Then in the South Asia region as well, recently it has been reported that even neighboring countries like Bangladesh have gone ahead of India with regard to per capita income. Latest reports from IMF, World Bank, Hunger Watch, and other global institutions have shown that poverty levels in India has doubled last year as a direct result of the pandemic and the lockdown. And according to these estimates, the number of poor people in the country has more than doubled to 134 million from 60 million. Now compare this with UNDP reports for the period 2006 to 2016. The UNDP, through its Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, had estimated that India had successfully lifted 271 million citizens out of poverty during this period. But after years of success in lifting people out of poverty and improving key indicators, India has started seeing a decline over the last few years. And this has been a result of the combination of the structural slowdown in the Indian economy, followed by the devastating impact of the pandemic. The estimates get even more alarming if you look at India's performance over the last 1 year. According to several credible estimates, India has contributed 57.3% of the growth of the global poor as a direct result of the pandemic. India contributed to 59.3% of the global middle class that slid into poverty over the last 1 year. According to the writer, the last time that India reported such an increase in poverty levels was during the first 25 years after independence. That is, between 1951 and 1974, India's poverty levels rose from 47% to 56%. But after that, India had consistently brought down the poverty levels due to its successful socio-economic intervention. But over the last 5 years, due to structural issues in the Indian economy and due to the devastating impact of the pandemic, India has started registering a significant increase in poverty levels. But unfortunately, there is no official estimation from the government of India that provides for an accurate representation of poverty levels in the nation. We can only take a calculated guess at India's slide into poverty based on such indirect estimations provided by third-party institutions and global institutions. But the need of the hour is official poverty levels in the country, which is brought out accurately by the government of India, because without exactly counting the poor, you cannot design economic solutions. And for this to happen, India will have to revisit its poverty line debate. See, India has made many attempts to estimate its poverty levels since pre-independence days. First, we had Dadabhai Naoroji, who brought out the earliest estimation of poverty line through his book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. Through his findings, he estimated the poverty line to be at 16 rupees to 35 rupees per capita per year. Then we had the National Planning Committee set up by Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose in 1938, which estimated a poverty line in the range of 15 to 20 rupees per capita per month. Then came the Bombay Plan of 1944, which was brought out by a small group of influential business leaders who suggested a poverty line of 75 rupees per capita per year. Then post-independence, several committees have been set up, primarily under the Planning Commission of India, the erstwhile Planning Commission of India, to estimate poverty levels in the country. First, we had the Planning Commission Expert Group of 1962, which formulated separate poverty lines for rural and urban areas. Then V.M. Dandekar and N. Rath made the first systematic assessment of poverty based on national sample survey data. They brought out this data in 1971, and this estimation was derived from the expenditure that was needed to sustain a minimum calorific intake. According to these experts, calorie count provided the best basis to estimate income and consumption levels, which in turn indicates poverty levels. Then came the Alag Committee of 1979, which drew up a poverty line on the basis of nutritional requirements and related consumption expenditure. And the Alag Committee also provided for adjustment to inflation levels. Then we had the Lakdawala Committee of 1993, which estimated poverty lines based on CPI index and provided for state-specific poverty lines. But the most recent committees which are of relevance to us are the Suresh Tendulkar Committee and the C. Rangarajan Committee. The Suresh Tendulkar Committee was constituted by the Planning Commission in 2009 to review the methodology for poverty estimation and to address the shortcomings of the previous methods. The shortcoming of the previous estimations was that calorific intake was taken as the basis to estimate poverty lines. This was deemed to be obsolete and inaccurate by the Suresh Tendulkar Committee, and it recommended a shift from calorie consumption based poverty estimation towards a uniform poverty line basket. It brought out its recommendations in 2011, and by adjusting prices for inflation levels and by keeping in mind purchasing power parity, it recommended that for rural areas, the poverty line would stand at 816 rupees per capita per month, and for urban areas, it would stand at 1000 rupees per capita per month. But these numbers caused a major controversy, as the numbers were considered to be very low for even basic sustenance, considering the high price levels. As per these estimates of the Suresh Tendulkar Committee, the total poverty levels in the country stood at 25.7% of the total population. Several experts criticized the findings of the Suresh Tendulkar Committee as it was deemed to be inaccurate, and this controversy led the Planning Commission to set up the C. Rangarajan Committee to review the recommendations again. Following this review, the C. Rangarajan Committee came out with its recommendations in 2014 and estimated that 29.6% of the population falls under the poverty line. It drew the poverty line at 47 rupees per day per capita in cities and 32 rupees per day per capita in rural areas. It drew these numbers based on basic nutritional requirements and on the basis of existing income levels in the country. But these findings were also criticized because experts pointed out that the Rangarajan Committee had missed the opportunity to go beyond the expenditure-based estimation of poverty, because global experience has clearly shown that poverty is always multi-dimensional. That is the reason why the United Nations Development Programme adopted the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index. As per this concept, poverty has multiple dimensions and it cannot be determined just by income and consumption levels. Under multidimensional poverty estimation, we need to go beyond income and consumption levels and consider other factors such as health, education, and the availability or non-availability of essential services and items. Following these controversies, today the poverty levels in India are determined by the Niti Aayog by relying upon data brought out by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. But however, of late, the government hasn't taken up an official exercise to estimate poverty levels. So currently we don't have an accurate picture of the number of poor people in the country, and the government has not been showing interest in taking up such an exercise despite the grave numbers that are being predicted. The writer points out, if the billionaires in the country can be counted and if their exact wealth can be estimated, then it is even more important to estimate the number of poor people in the country and get an accurate picture of the levels of poverty, because only that would drive us towards the right economic solutions. The first challenge for revising poverty estimation comes from the government itself, because governments are hesitant to acknowledge the rising poverty levels as they look at this from an electoral point of view. But if they look at this as a socio-economic development challenge, and if they come out with accurate numbers, it is going to help the government and the society at large to not just understand the exact extent of the problem, but it will also help the experts and the policy makers to design the right kind of policy interventions. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, in which the writer calls for decriminalization of suicide in India. See, under India's legal system, suicide has been criminalized and it has been declared as a criminal offense under Section 309 of the Indian Penal Code. As per this provision of the IPC, suicide has been declared as a criminal offense with a punishment of 1 year in jail along with penalties. This outdated provision is a direct result of the colonial legacy of the Indian Penal Code, and in fact it's interesting to note that Britain itself had decriminalized suicide back in 1961 by enacting the Suicide Act through the British Parliament. See, it's a well-acknowledged fact amongst healthcare and mental health care experts around the world that suicide is a result of either depression or severe mental illness, stress, trauma, or loss. In most cases, victims of suicide, they are in the need of help, and when there is enough scientific evidence to point towards this, the legal system should not be seeking retribution against those who attempt suicide. Instead, it should be giving them the option of reformative treatment, by providing them access to the right kind of mental health care, along with psychological support and counseling to deal with the mental stress factors that push them towards suicide in the first place. So, in this context, the need for decriminalizing suicide is very important, particularly in India, because the country has been registering nearly 1.34 lakh suicides every year as of 2018. This data has been brought out by the records of the National Crime Records Bureau, and even the WHO has pointed out that the Southeast Asia region, of which India is a part of, as per the WHO, has recorded the highest suicide rate. As per the NCRB under the Home Ministry, India's suicide rate has increased from 9.9% in 2017 to 10.2% in 2018. So the writer tries to make a case for decriminalizing suicide based on global precedents. In fact, within the Indian judiciary as well, and within India's legal system, there are enough precedents that establish the case for decriminalizing suicide under the IPC. See, back in 1972, a bill was introduced in the parliament, that is in the Rajya Sabha, to repeal Section 309. But this bill was not passed in the parliament because it failed to pass in the Lok Sabha as the house was dissolved. After this, no parliamentary initiative has been taken up or no legislative action has been taken up to repeal Section 309 from the law books. Since then, a debate has emerged within the legal fraternity and the medical community regarding the need to criminalize or decriminalize suicide. Those who are opposed to decriminalization, they make a reference to the observations of the court in the Jian Kaur case of 1996 and the Aruna Shanbag case of 2011. In the Jian Kaur versus State of Punjab case of 1996, the court held that right to life is a natural right that is embodied within the provisions of Article 21 of the Constitution. In this case, the court observed that suicide is an unnatural termination or extinction of life, and hence it is incompatible or inconsistent with the provisions of Article 21. The same findings were upheld by the court in the Aruna Shanbag case of 2011 as well. So those who are opposed to decriminalization, they point out to these observations of the court and they call for the retention of Section 309 in the IPC in order to establish a deterrence against suicide. However, the proponents of decriminalization base their argument on two other court rulings. In the Maruti Duval case of 1986, the court pointed out that if freedom of speech and expression also includes the right to remain silent, and if the freedom of association and movement also includes the right to not join any association or movement, then logically the right to life guaranteed under Article 21 should also include the right not to live. Then in 1994, in the Chenna Jagadeshwara versus State of Andhra Pradesh and P. Ratinam versus Union of India cases, the court held that punishing would not really deter suicide victims. And instead of this retributive approach, the court suggested to the government to follow a reformative approach where the state will facilitate the right kind of medical treatment, including mental health care and psychological counseling, to those who are suffering from suicidal tendencies and to those who have attempted suicides. Through these observations, the court had pointed out in both the cases that Section 309 of the IPC is void and unconstitutional. But despite these rulings, this provision has remained in the law books in the IPC. But an important change has been brought about in 2017 through the enactment of the Mental Health Care Act. Under this Act, we have Section 115 of Clause 1, under which any person who attempts to commit suicide shall be presumed, unless proved otherwise, to have severe stress, that is mental stress, and they shall not be tried or pressed with charges and punished under Section 309 of the IPC. It basically exempts those who commit suicide under mental stress from being punished under Section 309. Even though this exemption is welcome, it does not exactly decriminalize suicide, and the outdated Section 309 still continues to remain in the law books. Now, what will happen in cases where the mental stress factor cannot be proved? In those cases, the victims can still be booked under Section 309, and hence the writer is making an argument for government and legislative intervention in this regard, so that Section 309 can be repealed from the IPC itself. The writer makes it very clear that the time has come for India to repeal this controversial section and strike it down. Now let's take up another column from page number 7, in which the writer calls for a more federal tax structure in the country in order to improve center-state relations and as well as to reduce regional disparity. See, as you might know, India is considered to be a quasi-federal state. Even though federalism is a part of our basic structure, India is seen as a quasi-federal state because the constitution clearly provides for a unitary bias. That is, the central government clearly has more authority and power as compared to the federated units. This nature of the Indian constitution is quite understandable considering the difficult circumstances under which India was born. As soon as India gained independence from the colonial rulers, the unity of the country was under threat as several princely states stretching from Travancore to Junagadh and Hyderabad to Jodhpur and Bhopal were seeking independence from India. Then within a few months after becoming independent, Pakistan sponsored a tribal invasion of Jammu and Kashmir, thereby opening new external threats for India. So in the initial years following India's independence, the country was dealing with several internal and external threats. And naturally, the constitution, which was drafted in this context, took into account these internal and external threat factors and provided for a unitary bias by establishing India as a union of states. This model of Indian federalism was unlike the model of American federalism, because in the United States, the federated states have come together to form the union, whereas India has been set up as a union of states where the union is indestructible. So naturally, in every aspect of governance, be it legislative, judicial, taxation, financial powers, in almost every aspect, the constitution accords a higher set of authority and power to the central government as compared to the state governments. So when it comes to taxation, the center definitely enjoys a higher degree of authority and power over the states, especially with regard to direct taxes. Direct taxes such as income tax, corporate tax, they're all collected by the center, and later a part of it is distributed from the divisible pool of taxes to the states. Whereas in other federal countries like US, Switzerland and the others, the taxation structure is slightly different, where even the federated states are given more powers with regard to taxation, thereby reducing their dependency on the center. But here in India, the states are heavily dependent on the center, as the center is responsible for allocating the divisible pool of taxes. This financial devolution has to be done both vertically and horizontally by the center as per the recommendations of the Finance Commission, which is provided for under Article 280 of the Constitution. The Finance Commission comes out with a formula for this devolution, and the latest Finance Commission has prescribed a 41% vertical devolution of funds from the divisible pool of taxes to the states. This in turn is horizontally devolved to different states based on a formula depending on the population and the needs of each state. So this differential allocation to states definitely gives rise to regional disparity, as the center will always be motivated by political considerations while making these allocations. Upon this, the center imposes few taxes of its own, such as a cess, and even though it nearly collects 3.5 lakh crore rupees under cess, none of it is distributed to states. So essentially you have a situation where states are very much dependent on the center for their tax revenue, and in many cases this results in disputes between center and states, thereby affecting the harmony in center-state relations. Because in many instances the center may not be able to fulfill the recommended percentage, thereby leading to disputes being raised by the states. This could also give rise to regional disparity, because few states could get a higher allocation with regard to horizontal allocation, and few states might end up developing a higher percentage of dependency on central allocation. So this makes the ruling party at the center extremely powerful to exercise financial and taxation powers over states, thus leading to the weakening of the Indian democracy. The writer points out several drawbacks that exist in the current structure. He points out how this system of tax collection and distribution is resulting in cross-subsidization of underperforming states. According to him, this structure has clearly resulted in a divide between the North Indian states and the South Indian states, and as well as a divide has emerged between the developed states and the underdeveloped backward states. See, for example, the top five industrialized regions of the country, that is Maharashtra, Delhi, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Gujarat, they alone contribute 72% of the tax revenue to the center. Whereas the other states, which are seen to be backward, they hardly contribute any tax revenue, whereas they end up getting a higher percentage of the allocation. For example, look at India's largest state and the most populated state, Uttar Pradesh. It contributes just around 3.12% to the center's tax pool. But in turn, it receives a massive 17% in the allocation. Even in the case of Bihar, for every 100 rupees that it contributes to the central pool of taxes, it gets back 200%. Whereas the South Indian states, they receive only 51% back from the center for every 100 rupees they contribute. So this makes it clear that it is largely the developed states and the South Indian states which are contributing more to tax revenue, whereas a higher allocation is going towards the backward and the North Indian states. Upon this, there exists a political asymmetry between the North Indian and South Indian states and the developed and the backward states. Even though the North and the backward states contribute less to tax revenue, they exercise more political power at the center, largely because of the number of seats they have in the Lok Sabha. And this often works to the disadvantage of the developed states and the South Indian states. While there is a lot of opposition towards this cross-subsidy, there are many proponents of cross-subsidy as well, as they believe that this strengthens the unity of the nation. But it could also create a situation where regional disparity increases and regional divide increases further, thereby threatening the very integrity of the nation. For example, the writer points out that South Indian states in particular, they feel that the North Indian states are trying to impose their culture and language as they seem to have cornered political power at the center. The South Indian states and the developed states, which contribute more to tax revenue, they always feel that injustice is being done to them despite their better development indicators, especially with regard to their population growth. These developed states and South Indian states, they have achieved massive reduction in poverty levels and have even stabilized their population numbers. The exact opposite is true with regard to North Indian and backward states. So these factors give rise to resentment, which could be exploited by political elements to further the regional divide in the country and thereby threaten the unity and the integrity of the nation. So as a solution to all these problems, the writer suggests that our taxation structure should be made more federal, with the states being given more power to collect their own taxes and raise their own revenue. He argues that the states, if they are allowed to collect more taxes, it will reduce the dependency of some of the states on the center. Especially for the smaller backward states, their dependency on central devolution will go down. It will also reduce center-state conflicts because currently, center may not be able to fulfill its obligations towards certain states every year. As a result, many disputes are emerging, including legal disputes, and such disputes can be brought down if states are given more powers, more federal powers, to collect their own taxes and raise their own revenue. This would also help in addressing regional disparity, as then states would be raising revenue based on their own capabilities, and this would reduce the need for cross-subsidization. On these grounds, the writer calls for a more federal tax structure in which the states can directly collect more taxes, thus reducing their dependency on the center and even help in addressing regional disparity. Now let's look at this article from page number 1. The Supreme Court has asked the central government whether it has taken a decision to not pay ex gratia to families who have lost their loved ones to COVID-19. This question has been raised by the Supreme Court on the basis of a petition which has demanded the center to pay a ex gratia amount to the victims of COVID-19 families, because Section 12 of the Disaster Management Act makes it a legal obligation of the center to provide for such compensation or to provide for such ex gratia amount. The government itself had declared COVID-19 as a national disaster. Hence, the petitioners are invoking the Disaster Management Act, and Section 12 under it promises an ex gratia amount to be paid by the government to the victims of a disaster. To these questions raised by the Supreme Court, the center had said that providing such compensation to all the victim families would drain the resources, and the center argued in the Supreme Court that even though the government has the financial resources to provide for such a compensation, it would be better utilized to invest those resources in improving our health infrastructure and those financial resources could instead be used to trigger larger economic recovery. The center has said that it is focused on using these funds for providing essential food, medical care, and other emergency assistance instead of draining the resources on providing such ex gratia payment. Related to the same topic, we have an editorial on page number 6, which argues that families who have lost their breadwinners in COVID-19, they need supportive policies and a safety net which has to be offered by the government. While the editorial agrees with the argument of the government that financial resources should be deployed to improve healthcare infrastructure and to provide other essential services, at the same time, the government also has a responsibility to help out those families which were affected, especially the ones which lost their breadwinners due to the pandemic. The editorial uses the opportunity to give a call for universal healthcare and for increased public expenditure in healthcare. And even if the center falls short of financial resources, the editorial says that the government should not hesitate to widen the tax basket in order to bring in more revenue so that additional financial resources can be allocated to not just improve healthcare services and emergency services, but also to create a safety net for the victims' families. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: if the economy is to be repaired, the number of poor has to be meticulously counted. In the light of the statement, discuss poverty measurement in India. The second question: should suicide be decriminalized? Critically evaluate. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.